Um, I have been kind of treating some involved discussions on Sunday afternoon, and so I wanted to continue with a lesson that is related to our discussion of what we introduced as called meta-narrative, the idea of putting the whole Bible together in order to have a beginning, middle, and end, so to speak. And we have been contrasting what most likely you believe and you have been taught that we've kind of described as New Covenant theology. That is to say that Jesus is indeed the ultimate fulfillment of all of the Old Testament covenants, promises, types, and so forth, with dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is a different way of putting all of this stuff together, and it's contrary in many ways to what you would believe, but it is very popular. And it gives rise to many popular ideas, especially when it relates to end-time events. You've probably heard of rapture theology, the idea that we'll be raptured one day, and then there will be a 7-year period of tribulation, followed by the second coming of Jesus, which will be really his second coming. He will return and establish a 1,000-year reign over in modern Jerusalem, there on the mountain, the Temple Mountain. And then after the 1,000 years are done, when he rules over the world with his people, Jerusalem, Israel in Jerusalem, then there'll be the final judgment, the final resurrection of the unrighteous, and then the judgment, and then eternity will be ushered in following that. So it's very elaborate, and it is very fantastical in many ways, and it's been depicted in books and movies and such. So it's very popular. One of the most powerful purveyors of this, promoters of this doctrine, comes from Dallas Theological Seminary. They're in downtown Dallas, and so they have been a very strong, disseminator of this particular brand of theology. It goes back to the early 1800s in this form, and it has grown. It's a little bit waning now, but it was very popular toward the turn of the century with Left Behind movies and books and things like this. But you'll still hear it on a popular level on radio programs and such if you are inclined to listen to religious programming. And it's important for you to be able, I think, to recognize these kinds of things when you hear them. And before it started tonight, I noticed Denise was reading a book, and I said, "Oh, what are you reading there?" And she said, "Well, it's a book that I got from the Creation," it's not a museum, whatever it is down in Dallas, Creation Center thing. And of course, we've always enjoyed materials from the very scholarly scientists from a creationist perspective, right? They put out good movies and things that we've gone to see. But I told her, and she already knew this, I think, but I said, they are dispensational. It's called the Institute for Creation Research, right? ICR, and they originally was in California, and now they have several campuses and so forth. One's in Dallas. There's the Answers in Genesis, AIG, Answers in Genesis. They have the Ark exhibit in Kentucky somewhere, and the Creation Museum, which is quite an elaborate thing, and they are dispensational. There's another one, CMI, Creation Ministries International. It originated in Australia, I think, but they do have American and other places in the world where they have their work. All of these are dispensational, interestingly. And if you find some of their evangelistic tracts, at least the ones that I've seen, are based on those dispensations that I put up there before, where you have the dispensation of innocence, dispensation of conscience, dispensation of government, dispensation of promise, and so forth. And we are currently in what they would call the dispensation of grace, or the church age, which was really never foretold in the Old Testament. That's part of their theme, is that the church was not planned or foretold in the Old Testament. And just the kingdom of Israel that Jesus came to establish. He came to rule over Israel and rule over the world through Israel and such, but they rejected him. And so God, allowed him to be crucified for the forgiveness of everybody's sins. And now there is inserted this church age, or this dispensation of grace, and that's where we are today. But, they say, we are living in the end times. So we are seeing, they say, signs coming to pass. And they will point primarily to Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 11, and Luke chapter 21. That is a similar record of the same discourse of Jesus. And so we're living in the last days. So the signs are coming to pass, and the very next event that is on the prophetic calendar, they would say, is the rapture, where suddenly and unexpectedly all Christians will just be raptured, be taken into heaven. So the whole church across all of the world at the same moment will be brought up into heaven in a twinkling of an eye, in a moment. And so everyone who's left here on earth, the non-Christians, will be in wonder what in the world's going on, because, of course, Christians who might be flying planes at the time, the planes are going down. Christians who might be driving down the highway, their cars will go out of control. If your spouse is a Christian and you're not, you'll look over and there'll just be a pile of clothes there, because they're gone. And it's spectacular, that kind of thing. But that's the next plan. Next thing is we're waiting for the rapture. The church will be removed from the world, and then the whole world will enter into a 7-year period of tribulation. And during that time, there are all kinds of things, obviously. But eventually, the Jewish nation as a whole will come to faith in Christ. And he will return to rescue them and rule there in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Now, I didn't give any kind of reason as to why they get into all these details. We could, but that's kind of the point of many of these classes. We're just looking at some of these things. But what I want to do this afternoon now, in the time that we have left, probably only got about 3 hours, so we got to get on the ball here. Some of you are going, I wonder if he's serious. As I just want to look at Matthew 24, and I want to talk about it, obviously biblically, but this is a very important passage, because this is a passage they would go to say that we are living in the last days. And it is a prediction of a judgment of God that is coming, that Jesus is trying to warn his people about, and saying there are certain signs that will come to pass that gives you an idea that it's approaching. And so, this is where the dispensation will go and say he's talking about the end of the world. He's talking about right before the Great Tribulation. And so these are coming to pass because we can see them. So let's talk about this. Now, you've seen some of these pictures I put up before. These are some of the popular dispensational authors. Hal Lindsey, Charles Ryrie, John Wolford. There's several through the years. C.I. Scofield put out the Scofield Reference Bible, which was kind of the Bible for the premillennial, or the dispensationalists for many, many decades. But these are the kinds of statements they would make. All these signs which, and he's talking about Matthew 24, all these signs and many more which are just as visible point to the fact that this generation is the one that will see the end of the present world and the return of Jesus Christ. We are the generation Jesus was talking about. So he wrote this, obviously, in the 1980s. It's called the 1980s, the countdown to Armageddon. And he believed that the rapture would occur in 1988. And this was because Israel had become a nation, had been reestablished in 1948. And a generation is 40 years in the Bible, and you just do the math. 1988 is the end of that generation that Jesus was talking about, and that's when the rapture is going to take place. Obviously, he's been proven a false prophet, because we live in 2024, and yet he still puts books out, strangely enough. But he put out one called The Late Great Planet Earth, where he got into a lot of details about this rapture in 1988. But that just shows you the boldness with which they make their predictions, and evidently the obstinance of their followers, who, whenever they see that their prophets here are proven false, they still somehow put credence in them. Not everybody, many of them realize how absurd it is to continue to believe in things like people like this who've proven themselves wrong. But nonetheless, You had a whole new generation toward the turn of the millennium, the 90s and into the 2000s, with the onslaught of all of these fictional series, the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. And so they put out book after book that was fictional, but it was based on what they believed was the way the prophetic timetable would unfold and such. And movies and such have been made. But it's all based on believing we live near the rapture. It's on its way. Well, that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So I want to first of all just point out this phrase, the last days. Just the phrase itself. Well, I mean, yeah, you can understand the last days, meaning there's going to be no more days after the last days, and so that must mean the world is about to end. That's kind of a common way to understand the phrase. The Bible uses the phrase many times. For example, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 16, when Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost 2,000 years ago, and the people were asking, what does all this mean with all these men of Galilee speaking in the various languages? Look at what Peter said. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he quotes Joel, "It will come to pass in the last days that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh." Well, Peter is saying that came to pass in Acts chapter 2, and he called it the last days. That was 2,000 years ago. The last days, according to at least Peter here in this verse, began in the day of Pentecost with the pouring out of the Spirit. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2 says, God, who in various times in the past spoken to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the worlds. So the Hebrews writer claimed that these were the last days. That is the days he was writing the book of Hebrews. These last days. Well, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18, little children, it is the last hour. I'm just pointing out there's various places that use the phrase, but they claim that it was when they wrote. They claim that it was the first century. So how are we supposed to understand the last days? Or why would they call them the last days? That's 2,000 years ago. Well, if you remember our meta-narrative that I was trying to build our own framework on, it was based on the covenants. And so if we looked at the overall meta-narrative of the Bible, as far as covenants are unfolding, you have the first covenant in the garden with Adam. You have the Noahic covenant after the flood. You have the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12. And you have the Mosaic or the Sinaitic covenant with Israel when they were brought out of Egypt and entered into that covenant there with God as a nation. Anybody remember the next one? It's kind of a test, isn't it? The Davidic, that's when David was promised, I'm going to raise up your seed after you, and he's going to sit on your throne, and this kingdom will never, ever end. The Davidic covenant, well, within the time frame of this, the prophets were on the scene, and like Jeremiah, for example, would say, the days are coming that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And it won't be like the old one, but it will be a new one. And the defining characteristics is that I will forgive their iniquities, and their sins I will remember no more. We pointed out that Ezekiel made the point about this new covenant, and the defining characteristics there was, I will put a new heart of flesh in you and a new spirit. So it will be the forgiveness of sins and the giving of the Spirit. You see, Joel's idea of the last days is the pouring out of the Spirit. So, in other words, the last days is synonymous with a new covenant. That's what the last days mean. In other words, here's a way to point it. Here's a way to prove it or to explain it. What covenant comes after this? We got up to the new covenant. Now what comes next? There is nothing next. That's why it's called the last times. So does that help? It's very important, because certainly to say the last days, and depending on what context you have in your mind, it could be we think the end of the world is just right here because we live in the last days. No, it means the new covenant days, the final covenant, the last covenant, the last days. And that began when Jesus established the new covenant. And so this meta-narrative is how we interpret all of the revelation of God and how he explains his work in human history. These covenants build upon one another. They continue to expand upon one another, and they all reach their apex or their climax. They reach that in Christ. Christ is the fulfillment of all of that. And now the new covenant says, if you want to be in a relationship with God, you must be in Christ. And that's the only distinction that God makes that has any eternal ramifications. There's no distinction in your language, your nationality, your skin color, your occupation. No, only thing that matters is if you're in Christ or not. And that's what we mean here. Now, let's just read through this context to show that how to understand this. The Olivet Discourse is what it's called, where Jesus talks about signs that were to come to pass. And what is he talking about? Well, if you read chapter 24, verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and he sat," and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. If you look at verse 3, it says, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him." Well, here's a map of Jerusalem, and if you'll see, I don't have a pointer, but nonetheless, you will see that the city of Jerusalem is in the red here. The temple area is that lighter rectangle. So that's the temple. That's where Jesus was up until Matthew 24. But he departs, verse 1 of chapter 24, he departs the temple and he goes over to the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is over on the other side of that valley. And so he sets up on the Mount of Olives. His disciples come to him and he gives this speech. And all the while he's able to set up on that mountain and look across the valley to the temple. And so from that vantage point, it looks like this today. If you were sitting on the Mount of Olives looking across that valley down there in the forefront and up onto that Temple Mountain, that's the Temple Mountain. And so that's the location that Jesus is when he gives this speech. And it says in chapter 24, verse 2, it says, "Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things?'" And that's going to be an important phrase, these things. He's talking about the whole temple area. "Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Well, he's predicting the destruction of that temple. And then it says, he sat on the Mount of Olives, and his disciples came to him privately, and they asked, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" You might have a translation that says, "and of the end of the world." The word age, aionion, is the Greek, and it can be just an age or a world. It doesn't matter. When will be the end of all this that you're talking about? These are just some, there it is. These are just some artist renditions of, the kinds of things he's talking about. All the stones that went into constructing the temple. "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age of the world?" Now, the question is like, what exactly were they asking? What did they have in their mind? Well, that's an important consideration. It's not the be-all and end-all, because he might proceed to answer other questions that could be in their mind, and he does that all the time. But the point is obviously it's based off what he said, that there's going to be a great destruction of this temple, and they're asking, when is that going to happen? Is there going to be a sign that accompanies it so we'll know that it's about to happen when you come? See, they're assuming he's the one who's going to come and destroy it. You're coming, and of the end of the age. And so they're conflating all of those ideas in their minds. They're the ones asking the question. This isn't an inspired question. When I mean that, they're just asking questions in their mind. It doesn't mean that they had the right concepts in mind. It just means this was a question they had in mind. And most likely their concept was, my Lord is telling of the destruction of God's house here in Jerusalem, and that must mean the end of the world. Because you can't conceive of the world continuing if God doesn't live here, that kind of thing. It was just an entire conflation in their mind of all of these concepts. So Jesus is going to start answering the question as far as in their mind what they were asking, but he's going to, we'll see here, he's going to expand on some things. And I think that he will end up answering a couple of different questions at least. He's going to answer the question about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's going to give an answer there. And then eventually he's going to answer the question about the end of the world, the end of the age, the end of human history as we know it. But that's going to come much later, and we'll see how we get there. And it's right here, I think. If you'll notice in verse 20, does that say 34? Matthew 24, verse 34. This is after Jesus had been speaking for some time. He says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place." Well, there's that generation that we saw from the dispensationalists. They take it to mean the generation when Israel is reestablished as a nation. Jesus seems to be pointing to the generation that he's living in. This generation, as he said earlier, there are some standing among you who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God coming with power. Those kinds of things. So he's talking about his own generation. But from verse 34 up, evidently Jesus is saying everything from verse 34 before is going to take place in that generation. I mean, it's just what the text says. And I think that's what it means. And so, this generation, I just give some examples here where Jesus uses that. We don't have time to go to these. You can jot them down if you want, or you may not even care. But these are some passages where Jesus uses that phrase, and it always means this wicked generation that he's preaching to. The time frame and historical context that he lives in. Look at Matthew 23:36, however. So this is right before Matthew 24, when Jesus has given his seven-woe condemnation, a sevenfold woe to the scribes and the Pharisees, and calls them hypocrites. And so this is almost like his final declaration of condemnation against the religious elite in Jerusalem, those who should have spared the nation from the wrath of God, but they didn't. They misled the nation instead. And so he says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites," and he says it 7 times. Well, this was right before he left the temple for the last time. So look at verse 34. Verse 36. "Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Well, that's very similar to what he said in the verse we looked at before, but what is he talking about here? Well, look at verse 34 and 35. He says, "Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city." He's talking about his own apostles who are going to be abused by the Jewish people in the first century when they go out to preach the gospel. And he says, you're going to reject the gospel one last time. And then in verse 35 it says, "So that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel." That goes all the way back to Genesis 4, doesn't it? "From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." He's pronouncing judgment on first century Judaism. And so that's what he is going to do, because they ask him, when are you going to do these things? Well, that's what he meant in verse 34. It will be in this generation. All these things are going to come upon this generation. Now look at back in chapter 24, verse 35. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." Well, now he's going to talk about the passing away of heaven and earth. Well, now we're going to talk about creation, the whole creation, aren't we? That's how you refer to the creation, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? Well, here he seems to be bringing in a new subject. After he says all these things will happen to this generation, then he says, heaven and earth will pass away. So now maybe he's going to begin to answer their question about the end of the world, but he's going to have to, or not have to, but he does simply phrase it in this way now. Notice, verse 36. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Of what day and hour? When heaven and earth pass away. Does that make sense? And he says, no one knows that day and hour. Not even the angels in heaven, but my Father alone knows. Now, what's interesting and important about that is he has been given, up to this point, he's been given signs so that people will know when he comes in judgment on Jerusalem. We'll look at those signs in a moment, but I'm just saying, he's saying, okay, here's how you can know. Here's how you can gauge the thermostat. And when these things start to happen, you know that the time is coming. You better get out of the city and head for the mountains because it's almost there. It's on the doors. Well, so I do have signs that will predict the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem, but of the end of the world, there will be no signs. That's important. And that destroys or defeats, I believe, the dispensationalist idea that we can know when, we're living in near the rapture or whatever how they phrase it. So, in fact, he goes on to say in verse 37, it's going to be like the days of Noah. There again, a universal judgment, is it not? It involved the whole world. And he says, but you remember what happened in the days of Noah? Though he preached, people still didn't know. And they had no idea, it says. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. You see, those are activities that people do when they are not expected they're going to be standing before the judgment seat of God in the next few minutes. They're just going about life as a daily, enjoyment. But it says, they did not know until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not know until the flood came and took them all away. And then he says, that is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So this would be the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the world. So, contrary to the claims of dispensationalists, there will be no signs that predict when Jesus is going to return in judgment and end the world as we know it. There will be no signs. And that's what the rest of the chapter illustrates, and really the rest of chapter 25 continues to help us to get in our minds and to prepare. In other words, the message there is be ready always, therefore, because you're not going to have any warning. He could come in the next 5 minutes. You need to be ready at all times, and don't be looking for signs. Be ready always. So let's talk now about some of these signs. So we go back to chapter 24, verse 3 we read, when they're asking, tell us when will these things be and what will be the sign? Well, Jesus is going to just begin talking about everything that's going to occur within that generation. In verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. Now, I don't think he means many will come in the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He means they will come in the name of the Messiah. And he's the Messiah. But many people will be claiming, I am the Messiah. And he's saying that there will come and they claim to be the Christ. And they will deceive many. Now, of course, if we did go through the historical evidence and things that was recorded by other historians, primarily Josephus, who was a Jewish historian during the Jewish wars and such, he made mention of several of these people who rose up in Judaism and claimed to be the deliverer, the Messiah. In fact, many people believe Barabbas was just one such claimer. It said that he committed murder in what? By the way, you remember Barabbas. He's the one that the Jews said, we want you to release Barabbas and then kill Jesus. Well, they claimed Jesus was an insurrectionist, and that's why they wanted Pilate to kill him on the cross to put him to death. But they wanted to release Barabbas, and yet what was he? He was actually an insurrectionist. It says he committed murder in the insurrection. It didn't say which, it just says the, so evidently Matthew's readers knew about it, or John, or whoever wrote that. I can't remember. One of the gospel writers. But nonetheless, Barabbas, in Acts 4, you read about a Theudas, not a Theudas, a Theudas, like tube and tube, however you want to pronounce it. But the point is that there was a Theudas and somebody else in Matthew 4. They rose up to claim to be somebody to follow, and then that's what Gamaliel was saying. These people rise up all the time and people follow them, and then whenever they die, eventually the whole movement just dies out. So there are lots of false Christs, false messiahs that arose in the first century. So that was religious deception is what I have there. Verse 6 says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled. Okay, here I have military deception. Now, you can imagine how a dispensationalist could use that. He said, man, just turn on CNN or whatever and you'll see a war going on. So, yeah, you're going to hear of wars. This means we're in the last days. Well, this has always been the case. Jesus is talking about some specific set of wars. Now, in the first century, and especially the years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, you had Rome's worst year, historians would call it, and it was a year where there was a dynasty change from the Julian dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, to the Flavian dynasty. And there were like 3 or 4 emperors who all claimed the throne at one time. And that was about the year 68 to 69. And so it was after Nero died, and then it just went into chaos. Galba, Otho, Vitellius were 3 emperors in just a year. And then finally, it was Vespasian who finally gained control. And then his son's name was Titus. Titus was the general at the time when Rome sacked Jerusalem in AD 70. So they were hearing of all the political upheaval, all the military infighting going on because generals would claim certain ranks of the military and they would start fighting one another. Rome was in a civil war. But this very likely and probably most likely what Jesus is talking about. You'll hear of all this upheaval and unrest, and nobody's going to be certain what to do. Now, believe me, it's going to sound like 2024 in this election cycle. Is going to be a total and absolute confusing mess. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about his generation. He says, and by the way, he says, see that you're not troubled at this time because all these things must come to pass. The end is not yet. In other words, these are just precursors to more immediate signs. So, verse 7, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. That is the political problems, again, that I've been talking about with this civil war. And there will be, now you have natural disasters, famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. Well, this is just like the war idea. This has always been the case. Jesus has to be telling them that these are going to be things that affect your feeling of stability. It's going to be portents of unrest and trouble that will eventually result in the destruction of your people, of your nation. Okay? He says, all these are the beginning of sorrows, and then they will deliver you up and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. So there's going to be severe persecution of the church. He's telling his people this. He's saying, you're going to be going out and spreading this gospel to all the nations, and there's going to be great unrest. Now, you remember how the book of Acts unfolded this? It had to do with their connection immediately to Judaism. They thought that they were another sect of the Jews, do you remember? And they were causing trouble in every city. And so they were stoned or they were beaten or imprisoned and all of these things. And he's saying, when these things take place, know that this is still, things are still unfolding. And so you're in the will of God. He says, now many false prophets will be there and deceive many, but it's because of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. So stay focused on the truth. Stay focused on Christianity, on Christ. In verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Okay? Then the end will come. So he's saying these are things that have to take place first, then we can start talking about the very end. Now, of course, we know that there are places in the Bible that talk about, like Paul would say, the gospel has been preached to every nation under heaven. Colossians chapter 1, isn't it? Verse 20 and following. The gospel has gone out to the ends of the world. And so, in that sense, it's the civilized Roman world that was considered to be all of the nations at the time. Nations within the Roman Confederation is the idea. Colossians 1:23. And then the end will come. Verse 15. Therefore, now here's his most specific sign. When you see the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and then Matthew inserts this little parenthetical note, whoever reading, let him understand this. So he's saying, we've now reached the point. Jesus is saying, okay, here is going to be the immediate sign. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, he's talking about some local situation where those in Judea needs to flee to the mountains. Well, the mountains, we already showed a map there around Jerusalem. The mountains are just right across the valley. In other words, get out of the city and get into the mountains where you can have some safety because the city is going down. Now, let me show you one parallel passage that will make this most explicit. Look at Luke 21. And this is the parallel Olivet Discourse, but Luke's record of it. And Luke is not a Jew. Matthew's a Jew. Matthew is quoting from Daniel, Jewish Old Testament scripture. Luke doesn't do that for his readers. Here's what Luke says in this very same spot. Luke 21, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Are you seeing that? It's exactly the same thing. It's just that Luke is explaining what Matthew's talking about. The abomination of desolation means an abomination, that is something that's atrocious to God, is going to be in Jerusalem that's going to eventually cause its desolation. So Luke uses the word desolation. It says, what this means is that Jerusalem's desolation is near. So the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel is a prediction that Daniel included probably in Daniel 9. There are a couple of other places he uses that phrase. But this would be the Roman army, with Titus being the general over the Roman army in Jerusalem, or in Judea, and approaches Jerusalem in the years 69 and into the year 70. And by September of AD 70, they breach the walls, they go in, and they've been starving to death for a year, they've been eating one another. It's a complete picture of hell in that place. But, the historians would say it's interesting that all the Christians got out of town. All the Christians left Jerusalem before that took place, where they got locked in the city. They were in the mountains, and they fled, and they were kept safe in the mountains. Why? Well, because they listened to what Jesus said here. And Jesus was talking to them about what was going to take place in that year. So you can see the local idea in all of these phrases. We're back in Matthew 24. Look at verse 17. Let him who is on the housetop not go down and take anything out of his house. In other words, whenever you see those armies approaching, it's time to get out of there as fast as you can. Don't waste any time. Don't even go back and save your laptop. Get out of there. You'll be glad you did. And on and on, Verse 20, pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. So they needed to pray, Lord, please don't let the armies come on the Sabbath day because all the gates are going to be shut. And I'm going to have to figure out how to way to climb over the wall or whatever, scale the fence. And then he says in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, and not ever shall be. Now, I'm seeing a past, present, and future in Jesus' own words here. And he's talking about the tribulation that's going to happen in Jerusalem in AD 70. It's never happened in the past. It's never something that's going on anywhere else in the world at the time, nor in the future. Well, if this is the end of the world, there wouldn't be a future in that sense. But these are just little evidences to show the what I think is inconsistency. Now, here is probably the more difficult passage for those who would take an interpretation that I'm trying to defend here, that I believe is the correct one. And you all already know where I'm going, don't you? Verse 29, where it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. My translation says will appear in heaven. It really should say, then the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. There's a big difference. But nonetheless, that's the way my translation puts it. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Now, you read those verses, and you're thinking, that didn't happen in AD 70. And now you're going to think I'm joking, but I'm not. It's 2:27. And so I'm not going to go on from here. See, I'm just trying to whet your appetite for next time. So next week we will talk about this and how are we supposed to put this together? Because, as we said earlier, by verse 34, he's going to say, assuredly all these things shall come to pass in this generation. And yet he seems to be depicting cosmic upheavals and the falling of stars and such cosmic disturbances that have not happened yet, supposedly. So, I don't know if that's a good way to end a lesson or not, but that's the way I'm going to end it. We're going to talk about this. It's apocalyptic language and imagery, but that's going to be the most difficult part, I think, for those who take a preterist interpretation, which is what I've been describing to you this whole time. It's called a preterist interpretation, not a futurist interpretation like the dispensationalists. So we'll talk more about that next time and see how we're supposed to interpret that. But so far, I think we've seen the main point is that dispensationalists take the approach to this chapter of saying it applies to today. All of the chapter applies to today, and we're seeing the signs come to pass. And we would say that's not the accurate way to understand what Jesus is saying. He is depicting the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 that happened within 40 years of his speech on that occasion. And so we will, I feel it's incomplete, but I guess it is. So we will go from there, and we will have a song of invitation, and then next week we'll finish the lesson and continue to talk about that. So thank you so much for your attention. Let's stand and sing a final song, and then Jeremy will lead us in our final prayer, and we'll be dismissed.